There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the plain, unassuming clothes of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator in a sleeping apartment. They do not announce themselves with trumpets or thunder. They simply are. A choice made without thinking, a gesture offered without expectation. And it's only later, sometimes years later, when you trace the map of your own heart, that you find the X marking the spot and realize you were standing on buried treasure all along, completely unaware of the immense weight and value of the ground beneath your feet. For me, that moment looked like a man I knew sleeping on my couch, and the simple, monumental act of laying a blanket over him. He had arrived at my door an hour past midnight, a ghost haunting the edges of our shared shift work schedule. Sam. He hadn't called, which was unusual. He was a creature of habit and polite consideration, a man who would text to say he was running 3 minutes late. But tonight, he just appeared, framed in the yellow light of my hallway, looking like a ship that had been battered by a storm I knew nothing about. His usual easy energy, the thing that drew people to him like moths, was gone. In its place was a quiet, hollowed-out exhaustion that seemed to carve new lines around his eyes. He didn't offer an explanation, and I, in my own quiet way, knew better than to ask for one. Some wounds are too fresh to bear the weight of a question. "Can I?" he had started, his voice rough, gesturing vaguely at the living room behind me. He didn't need to finish the sentence. I had already stepped aside, opening the door wider, creating a passage from his world into mine. He had murmured a thank you, the sound barely disturbing the air, and drifted towards the old, worn corduroy couch that had seen me through college and 3 different apartments. He sank into it not like a guest, but like a man surrendering. He folded into himself, one arm tucked under his head, his long legs drawn up. Within minutes, the steady, rhythmic sound of his breathing filled the small room, a quiet metronome marking the passage of a difficult night. And so I stood there, in the silence of my own home, watching him. The city was a distant murmur beyond the glass, but in here, the world had shrunk to the space between me and the couch. This was the moment. The ordinary, unassuming Tuesday night that was, in fact, the beginning of everything. I saw the slight tremor in his hand, even in sleep, the tension still clinging to his shoulders. The air conditioning kicked on, and I noticed the goosebumps on his arms. Without conscious thought, I moved to the linen closet, my feet silent on the worn hardwood floors. I pulled out the old quilt, the one my grandmother had made, heavy and soft and smelling faintly of cedar. I unfolded it, the fabric whispering in the quiet, and gently, so gently, I draped it over him. My fingers brushed against the back of his neck, and a jolt, quiet as static but powerful as lightning, went through me. He sighed in his sleep, a soft, vulnerable sound, and settled deeper into the cushions, pulling the quilt closer. I retreated, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. It was just a blanket, a simple act of kindness for a friend in need. But in the silent, honest architecture of my own heart, I knew it was more. It was the first brick laid in a foundation I didn't yet have a blueprint for. It was a prayer, an offering, a confession spoken in the language of thread and cotton. It was the moment I stopped just observing my life and started, ever so carefully, to participate in it. We met under the cold, sterile glow of fluorescent lights, in a place where time seemed to bend and warp. It was a third-shift job at a network operations center, a cavernous, climate-controlled room filled with rows of humming servers that held fragments of other people's lives. Our job was to watch the monitors, to be the human failsafe for the intricate, invisible dance of data. It was a job for ghosts, for people who preferred the quiet hum of machinery to the clamor of the daylight world. I was there because the solitude fed my photography. The long, silent hours gave me space to think, to see the world in frames and exposures, and the pay was just enough to cover rent and film. I didn't know why Sam was there. He seemed like a creature of the sun, broad-shouldered and built with the easy, athletic grace of the rugby player he'd once been in college. His laughter, when I first heard it, felt like it was breaking a sacred vow of silence in that digital monastery. Our friendship didn't start with a conversation. It started with a shared silence that slowly became comfortable. For the first few weeks, we were just two bodies occupying the same space, separated by a console and a dozen blinking lights. I was the quiet observer, a role I had perfected over a lifetime. I noticed the small things about him. The way he'd tap a frantic, complex rhythm on his desk when he was bored, the way his eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, would scan the monitors with a focus that seemed too intense for the task at hand. He had a small, faded photograph taped to the edge of his screen, a smiling woman with dark hair. I learned later her name was Sarah. He wore a silver ring on a leather cord around his neck, and he would sometimes hold it, rubbing his thumb over the smooth, worn surface when he thought no one was watching. I, in turn, was a closed book. I kept my space meticulously organized, my personal effects limited to a thermos of black coffee and a well-worn paperback. I offered little of myself, not out of unfriendliness, but out of a deep, ingrained habit of self-protection. My feelings had always been things I developed in a darkroom, coaxing them into existence slowly, carefully, in private. To expose them to the raw light of day felt dangerous, reckless. And my feelings for Sam, which began to surface with the slow, inevitable pull of a tide, felt the most dangerous of all. It started as a simple appreciation for his presence, a low-level hum of warmth in the cold, sterile room. He broke the monotony. He was a splash of vibrant, chaotic color in my grayscale world. The first words we exchanged beyond good night, or your turn for a break, were about coffee. He had run out, and the machine in the break room produced a liquid that was an insult to the very concept of the beverage. He looked over at me, a desperate, almost comical panic in his eyes. I would commit a felony for a decent cup of coffee right now, he'd said, his voice a low rumble. I, without a word, simply unscrewed the lid of my thermos and slid it across the console to him. He looked at the thermos, then at me, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. It was like watching the sun rise. You're a lifesaver, he'd breathe, pouring a cup. The coffee was strong, black, and exactly how he liked it. I knew this because I had overheard him complaining about the breakroom machine to another coworker a week earlier. I hadn't stored the information consciously. It had just been filed away, another small, seemingly insignificant detail in the vast catalog of Sam that was beginning to accumulate in my mind. That small act, that shared thermos of coffee, became a bridge. The silence between us was now punctuated by conversation. We talked about meaningless things at first, bad movies, the weirdest trouble ticket we'd ever had to resolve, the merits of different pizza toppings. But slowly, layer by layer, we began to peel back the anonymity of the workplace. I learned that he was working this job to save up for a down payment on a house, a future he was building with Sarah. He talked about her with an easy, comfortable affection that I found myself envying with a quiet, persistent ache. He had a plan, a map for his life that was clear and well-defined. He spoke of weekend hikes, of building a deck, of a dog they were planning to get. He was an architect of a life I could only imagine. I, in turn, offered up carefully curated pieces of myself. I told him about my photography, about my love for capturing the forgotten, overlooked corners of the city. I described the magic of the darkroom, the way an image emerges from the chemical bath like a memory being coaxed into the light. He was a surprisingly good listener. He'd lean forward, his chin resting on his hand, and ask questions that were insightful and curious. He didn't just hear what I said. He seemed to genuinely want to understand it. I don't get art, he confessed one night, but I get the way you talk about it. It's like you're building something. Just like I'm trying to build a house. That comparison, so simple and yet so profound, struck a chord deep inside me. He saw a parallel in our pursuits, a shared language of creation. My feelings for him deepened, shifting from a quiet hum to a constant, resonant frequency. It was a dangerous, secret thing, a fragile negative I kept hidden from the light. I was acutely aware of the geography of our friendship. There was a clear, uncrossable border marked platonic, and on the other side of it was Sarah, the house, the dog. the entire life he was so carefully constructing. To even entertain the thought of crossing that border felt like a betrayal. So I became a master of sublimation. The yearning I felt was channeled into my art. I started a new series of photographs, portraits of empty spaces that felt full of presence, a rumpled bed, a chair pulled away from a table, a single coffee cup left on a counter. They were all, in a way, portraits of him, or rather, portraits of the space he occupied in my mind. They were photographs of a ghost, a presence I could feel but never touch. Our friendship settled into a comfortable rhythm, a predictable orbit we maintained for nearly a year. We were work friends, night shift companions who made the long, silent hours bearable for each other. We rarely saw each other in the daylight. Our world was one of artificial light and the quiet companionship of 3 a.m. I was content with this. Or rather, I had convinced myself I was. The quiet ache of my unspoken affection was a familiar companion, a small, secret weight I carried. It was a price I was willing to pay for the simple, uncomplicated gift of his friendship. I had built sturdy walls around my heart, and I believed they were impenetrable. I had learned to live with the ghost. I had no idea that a storm was coming that would not only breach my walls, but wash away the very ground they were built on, leaving me exposed, vulnerable, and terrifyingly, wonderfully alive. The shift began subtly, a change in the atmospheric pressure of our friendship that I felt before I could name. It started with the photograph on his monitor. One night, it was just gone. The small, faded picture of Sarah, which had been a constant landmark in our shared landscape, had vanished, leaving behind a small, clean rectangle on the beige plastic, a ghost of an image. Sam said nothing about it, and I, adhering to our unspoken code, asked nothing. But its absence was a shout in the quiet room. A few days later, he stopped talking about the house. The weekend plans he used to recount with such enthusiasm were replaced by vague, non-committal answers. The easy light in his eyes began to dim, replaced by a clouded, troubled look. The architect had put down his blueprints. The storm finally broke on a rainy Tuesday night. It was the night he showed up at my door, the night I laid the blanket over him. He had slept for nearly 12 hours, a deep, exhausted sleep that seemed less like rest and more like a temporary death. When he finally woke, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across my living room floor. He sat up slowly, the quilt pooling around his waist, and looked at me with an expression of such profound lostness that it felt like a physical blow. "We ended it," he said, his voice thick with sleep and sorrow. "Sarah and me." He didn't need to say more. The empty space on his monitor, the canceled plans, the hollowed-out look in his eyes, it all clicked into place, a painful, final focus. That was the catalyst. His carefully planned life had been demolished, and he was standing in the wreckage, adrift. And in his disorientation, he had navigated, not to his family or his other friends, but to my small, quiet apartment. I became his harbor. He started coming over after our shifts, not every night, but often enough that it became a new part of our routine. He said he couldn't stand the silence of his own place, a space that was once filled with shared dreams and now echoed with their absence. My apartment, by contrast, was a neutral territory. It held no memories of her, no ghosts of a future that would never be. It was just a quiet, safe space, and I, its quiet, safekeeper. Our time together shifted. We were no longer just colleagues sharing a sterile workspace. We were two people sharing a home, however temporarily. We'd watch old movies, the dialogue a soft murmur beneath the sound of the city. He'd sit on one end of the couch, and I on the other, a respectable, friendly distance between us. But as the nights wore on, the geography of the couch began to change. He would fall asleep, his head slumping against the cushions, and in his sleep, he would drift, a slow, unconscious migration across the corduroy expanse until his shoulder was pressed against mine. The first time it happened, I froze. My entire being became a sensor, acutely aware of the point of contact, the warmth seeping through my shirt, the weight of him against me. I sat there for over an hour, my muscles aching, my breath held shallow in my chest, terrified that if I moved, I would wake him, and the spell would be broken. He was seeking comfort, I told myself. It was a purely platonic act, the unconscious seeking of warmth and presence in a time of emotional crisis. It meant nothing. I repeated this mantra to myself over and over, a desperate litany against the rising tide of hope in my chest. But his presence was a constant, low-grade fever in my system. My home, once my solitary sanctuary, was now charged with a new energy. The air felt different, thicker, humming with unspoken things. I became hyper-aware of everything. The scent of his shampoo on the couch pillow, the way he left his coffee mug on the counter, the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. My quiet, ordered world was being gently, irrevocably rearranged by his presence. I was walking a tightrope, suspended high above a canyon of my own making. On one side was the safety of our established friendship. On the other was the terrifying, unknown territory of what I truly wanted. Every night he spent on my couch, every accidental touch, every shared silence, was a gust of wind threatening to send me plummeting. I was an artist who worked with light and shadow, and suddenly, I was living in a world of gray. The lines were blurring, the definitions shifting, and I was losing my focus. He was grieving, and I was his friend. That was the simple, undeniable truth. But beneath that truth was a more complex, dangerous one. I was falling more and more in love with him, and I was terrified that the comfort he was seeking was something I was fundamentally incapable of giving him without betraying the secret I had guarded for so long. The shift had happened. The ground beneath us was unstable. I just didn't know if we were heading for solid land or a complete collapse. The ritual began without intention, born of exhaustion and a deep, unspoken need. It started with him falling asleep on the couch, a regular occurrence that I had learned to navigate with a carefully constructed neutrality. I would let him sleep, sometimes for hours, before gently rousing him with a quiet, "Hey, you should probably get to bed." I had made up the spare room for him, a small, monk-like cell with a comfortable bed and clean sheets. It was a designated, platonic space, a clear architectural boundary. For the first few weeks, he used it. I would hear the click of the door closing, a sound that both reassured and disappointed me. It was the sound of the line being respected, the border of our friendship held firm. But then, one night, the click never came. I had gone to my own room, leaving him stirring on the couch. I lay in the dark, listening. I heard him get up, the sigh of the old cushions rising. I heard his footsteps in the hall, the soft creak of the floorboards. They paused outside the guest room, and then they continued, stopping outside my own door. I held my breath. The doorknob turned with an agonizing slowness. My door wasn't locked, it never was, but it felt like he was breaking through a fortress wall. The door opened just a crack, spilling a thin sliver of hallway light across my floor. He stood there for a long moment, a silhouette in the doorway. "Leo," he whispered, his voice small, almost childlike. "Are you awake?" My heart was a trapped bird, beating frantically against my ribs. "Yeah," I managed to say, my own voice a stranger to my ears. "What's up?" There was another long silence, filled with a tension so thick I could taste it, metallic and electric on my tongue. "Bad dream," he finally said, the words sounding like a flimsy excuse even in the dark. Would it be weird if I? He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The question hung in the air between us, immense and fragile. I was the curator of my own solitude, a man who had never willingly shared his sleeping space with another soul. Every instinct screamed at me to protect that solitude, to maintain the boundary. But the sight of him standing there, so vulnerable and lost in the half-light, overrode every defense I had. "No," I said, the word coming out softer than I intended. "It's not weird." He slipped into the room, closing the door behind him, plunging us back into darkness. I heard him navigate around the bed, and then felt the dip of the mattress as he lay down on the far edge, as far from me as he could get. He lay stiffly, on his back, his breathing tight and controlled. I did the same, a mirror image of his tension. We were two statues lying side by side in a mausoleum, the space between us a charged, uncrossable chasm. We didn't speak. We didn't touch. but his presence was a wildfire on my skin. The air was thick with the scent of him, the simple, clean smell of his soap and the faint, musky scent of his skin. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small distance that separated us. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of his breathing. Every inhale and exhale a measure of this new, terrifying intimacy. That night established the new ritual. The couch was abandoned. The guest room was forgotten. After our shifts, he would come to my apartment, and when sleep finally claimed us, he would end up in my bed. The pretext of a nightmare was used only once. After that, no reason was given or required. It simply became what we did. But the rules of engagement were strict, unwritten but rigidly enforced. We maintained the chasm between us, a sliver of cold sheet that represented the last bastion of our platonic friendship. We slept back to back, two parentheses enclosing an empty space, never touching. It was a kind of exquisite torture. To be so close to what I wanted most, and yet so fundamentally far away was a constant, dull ache. My internal monologue became a frantic, obsessive analysis of this new reality. I was a detective searching for clues in a case with no witnesses. Did the slight shift of his weight in the night mean something? Was the fact that he was sleeping more soundly now a sign of something deeper than just exhaustion? I began to see our shared bed as a kind of darkroom, a space where the truth of our relationship was slowly, painstakingly developing. I just couldn't tell what the final image would be. Was this a picture of two friends finding solace in a difficult time, or was it the faint, emerging outline of something more? The ambiguity was maddening. It was a source of both profound comfort and intense anxiety. Having him there, a warm, breathing presence in the lonely hours of the night, was a balm to a part of my soul I hadn't even realized was wounded. But the fear of misinterpreting it, of building a palace of hope on a foundation of sand, was a constant, chilling terror. The ritual evolved slowly, the erosion of boundaries happening at a glacial pace. The chasm of cold sheet between us began to narrow, inch by silent inch, over the course of weeks. It was never a conscious decision. It was the simple physics of sleep, of two bodies in a shared space unconsciously seeking warmth. One morning, I woke up to find his hand resting on the mattress, just a hair's breadth from my own. I lay there, perfectly still, studying the sight. His fingers, long and capable, the nails neatly trimmed. A small, pale scar ran across his knuckles. I had an overwhelming urge to close that small distance, to lace my fingers with his. The desire was so powerful it was a physical force, a magnetic pull. But I resisted. I was the quiet observer, the watcher on the walls. I could not, would not, be the one to make the first move. To do so would be to risk shattering this fragile, beautiful, terrifying thing we were building in the dark. The tension was becoming unbearable, a string pulled so taut it had begun to hum. The unspoken was growing louder than any words we could have said. It was in the way he looked at me over his coffee cup in the morning, a long, searching gaze that I could never quite decipher. It was in the way he started leaving things at my apartment, a toothbrush in the bathroom, a sweatshirt draped over a chair, a book on the nightstand. He was weaving himself into the fabric of my life, his threads becoming indistinguishable from my own. He was building a home within my home, and I didn't know if he was even aware he was doing it. The ritual had taken on a life of its own, a silent, powerful current that was pulling us both out into a deep, unknown ocean. I could no longer see the shore. All I could do was hold on and pray that we were heading somewhere safe. The crossing happened on a Thursday. There was nothing remarkable about the day. It was as ordinary as all the others. Rain lashed against the windows, a steady, percussive rhythm that seemed to insulate us from the rest of the world. We had finished our shift, and the exhaustion was a heavy cloak on our shoulders. We didn't even bother with a movie. We moved through the pre-sleep motions in a shared, comfortable silence, brushing our teeth, changing clothes, the quiet domesticity of it all feeling both perfectly natural and shockingly intimate. We settled into bed in our usual way, back to back, the familiar chasm of sheet between us. But tonight, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was full, charged with the accumulated weight of all the nights that had come before. The air itself felt thick, humming with a low-frequency energy that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I lay there, listening to the rain and the sound of his breathing, my mind unusually quiet. The frantic analysis, the constant questioning, had ceased. It was as if some part of me knew that a verdict was about to be delivered. I was no longer an observer. I was a participant, waiting for the scene to play out. Hours seemed to pass. I was hovering in that strange, liminal space between wakefulness and sleep when I felt him move. It wasn't the usual unconscious shifting of a sleeper. It was a deliberate, conscious turn. I felt the mattress dip as he rolled onto his side to face my back. I remained perfectly still, my own back a wall of feigned sleep. I could feel the heat of his body, closer now than it had ever been. I could feel his breath on my neck, warm and steady. "Leo," he whispered. His voice was a low vibration in the dark, and it went through me like an electric current. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat had closed up, my lungs forgetting their function. He didn't say my name again. He just stayed there, his presence a question mark pressed against my spine. The silence stretched, taut and shimmering. And then, he moved again. His arm, tentative and slow, came around my waist. His hand rested on my stomach, his fingers splayed out against my t-shirt. The touch was electric. Every nerve ending in my body fired at once. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't the product of sleep. It was a clear, unambiguous, terrifying choice. His hand was so warm, the weight of it so solid, so real. It was an anchor in the storm that was raging inside me. He pulled himself closer, pressing his chest against my back, until there was no space left between us at all. He tucked his head into the space between my shoulder blades, his forehead resting against my spine. His legs tangled with mine, a comfortable, unconscious intertwining. He sighed, a long, slow exhalation of breath that seemed to carry with it weeks of tension and uncertainty. He was holding me, and I, in my stillness, was letting him. My carefully constructed walls, the fortress I had spent a lifetime building, crumbled into dust in that single, silent moment. All the analysis, all the fear, all the desperate attempts to define what was happening between us, it all dissolved in the simple, profound reality of his touch. I don't know how long we lay like that. Time had ceased to be a linear thing. It was just this moment, suspended in the darkness, wrapped in the sound of the rain. Eventually, I knew I had to respond. I couldn't remain a passive recipient. This had to be a mutual act. Slowly, so slowly, I lifted my own hand and placed it over his, my fingers closing over his knuckles. He responded instantly, his fingers tightening their grip on my shirt, lacing with mine. It was an answer. It was a confirmation. It was a quiet, desperate, beautiful confession made without a single word. Then I turned. I rolled onto my other side to face him, a slow, deliberate movement. In the faint gray light filtering through the window, I could just make out the shape of his face, his eyes open and watching me. His expression was one of raw, unguarded vulnerability. The easy confidence he usually wore like a second skin was gone. In its place was a mixture of fear and hope and a question that he didn't seem to know how to ask. So I answered it for him. I lifted my hand, the one that wasn't holding his, and gently cupped his jaw, my thumb stroking the rough stubble on his cheek. He leaned into my touch, his eyes fluttering closed for a second, a silent surrender. The space between our faces, which had for so long felt like miles, was now just a few inches. I could feel the warmth of his breath on my lips. This was it. The precipice. The point of no return. "Sam," I whispered, and the sound of his name in my own mouth felt like both a prayer and a warning. He opened his eyes, and they were dark pools of emotion. He didn't speak. He just watched me, giving me every opportunity to retreat, to pull back to the safety of the shore. But I was done with the shore. I had been adrift for too long. I leaned in, closing that final, infinitesimal distance, and pressed my lips to his. The kiss was not passionate or demanding. It was tentative, soft, a question asked in the gentlest possible way. It was a discovery, a mapping of new territory. His lips were softer than I had imagined. For a moment, He was perfectly still, and a sliver of panic shot through me. But then he kissed me back. A soft pressure, a sigh of release, a mutual agreement. It was the breaking of a long, painful fever. It was the end of the ritual. And in the quiet, rain-soaked darkness of my small bedroom, it was the beginning of everything else. The morning after was a study in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one we had grown accustomed to. The comfortable, charged silence of the night before had been replaced by something brittle and sharp. I woke first, to the pale, watery light of a post-rain dawn. Sam was still asleep, but he had retreated to his side of the bed. The chasm was back, wider and more desolate than ever. He was turned away from me, his shoulders hunched, as if creating a physical barrier. The memory of the kiss, of his arms around me, felt like a dream, a phantom limb I could still feel but could no longer see. The reality was this cold, empty space between us. When he finally woke, he moved with a tense, guarded economy of motion. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the wall, on the floor, anywhere but on my face. The air was thick with unspoken recriminations, with the ghost of a line crossed. He mumbled something about needing to get home, to do laundry, a flimsy, transparent excuse that felt like a slap. He dressed quickly, his movements jerky and unnatural. I sat up in bed, the sheets pulled around my waist, feeling utterly exposed, as if he could see the frantic, desperate hope that had taken root in my chest the night before. I wanted to say something, to ask him what was wrong, to bridge this new, terrifying distance, but the words wouldn't form. I was paralyzed by the fear that if I spoke, the entire fragile structure of the night before would shatter. He paused at the bedroom door, his hand on the knob, his back still to me. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought he was going to turn, to say something that would make it all okay. "I'll see you at work," he said, his voice flat and distant. And then he was gone. I listened to his footsteps retreat down the hall, the click of the front door opening and closing. And then there was only silence. A profound, crushing silence that was heavier and more absolute than any I had ever experienced in this apartment. The space that had been our sanctuary now felt like a crime scene, haunted by the evidence of a transgression. I had misinterpreted everything. I had been a port in a storm, a convenient source of warmth, and in my foolish, hopeful heart, I had mistaken it for something more. The pain was a sharp, physical thing, a shard of glass in my gut. The next few days were a special kind of hell. He avoided me. My texts went unanswered, my calls went straight to voicemail. At work, he was a ghost of himself, polite but distant, our interactions limited to the barest professional necessities. The easy camaraderie, the shared jokes, the comfortable silence, it was all gone, replaced by a strained, painful formality. He took his breaks alone. He no longer drank my coffee. He had rebuilt the walls between us, higher and thicker than before, and I was left on the outside, shivering in the cold. I cycled through a storm of emotions, confusion, hurt, anger, and a deep, gut-wrenching despair. I replayed the kiss, the embrace, over and over in my mind, searching for the moment I had gotten it so wrong. Had I forced it? Had he just been seeking a moment of human connection, and I had loaded it with a meaning it was never meant to carry? The self-doubt was a corrosive acid, eating away at my confidence, at the memory of what had felt so real and true in the dark. I knew I couldn't let it go on. This limbo was worse than an outright rejection. The not knowing, the silence, was a poison. I had to confront him. I had to risk the final, complete demolition of our friendship for the chance of a single, honest answer. I waited until the end of our shift, as the sky was beginning to bruise with the first light of dawn. I saw him heading for his car, his shoulders slumped in that familiar, exhausted way. I caught up to him in the near-empty parking lot, the air cold and damp. "Sam," I said, my voice sounding louder than I intended in the quiet morning. He stopped but didn't turn around. I could see the tension in his back, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "We need to talk," I said, moving to stand in front of him, forcing him to look at me. His eyes were shadowed, filled with a turmoil that mirrored my own. He wouldn't meet my gaze, focusing instead on a point somewhere over my shoulder. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice rough. I messed up. I'm sorry." The apology was like a knife twist. "Sorry for what?" I pressed, my voice shaking slightly despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "For kissing me? Or sorry that it happened at all?" He finally looked at me then, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, panicked confusion. "I don't know," he whispered, the words raw and honest. "Leo, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm so messed up right now. After Sarah, everything is. I just needed a friend. And I crossed a line. I used you. And that wasn't fair." His confession was a jumble of self-recrimination and fear, but hidden within it was the one thing I needed to hear. He wasn't saying the kiss meant nothing. He was saying he was terrified of what it did mean. He was a man who had a map, a plan, and I was an unforeseen detour that led to a place he didn't recognize, a place that scared him. "You didn't use me," I said, my voice softening. "Don't say that. I was there too. I was a willing participant." I took a step closer, closing the distance he had so carefully tried to create. "I'm not going to pretend it didn't mean anything to me, Sam. It did. And I think it meant something to you too. And I think that's what's scaring you." He flinched, a subtle but definite reaction, a confirmation. He looked away again, shaking his head. "I'm not. That's not who I am," he stammered, the words tripping over themselves. "I've only ever been with women. My whole life it was supposed to be with Sarah, and there it was. The heart of it. It wasn't about me, not really. It was about him. It was about the identity he had built for himself, the future he had envisioned, and how his feelings for me didn't fit into any of it." He was struggling to reconcile his actions with his own self-perception. The withdrawal, the avoidance. It was a retreat from a truth he wasn't ready to face. "Who you are is not about who you've been with," I said gently. "It's about who you are right now." In this moment, I reached out, my hand hovering in the space between us, not touching him, but offering a connection. "I'm not asking you to define anything. I'm not asking you for a label or a promise. I'm just asking you not to run away. Don't run away from me. And don't run away from yourself." Tears welled in his eyes, and he swiped at them angrily with the back of his hand. He looked at me, his defenses finally, completely down. The fear was still there, but beneath it was something else, a flicker of relief, of gratitude. The confrontation had been a risk, a gamble that could have ended in disaster. But instead of pushing him further away, it had brought him back. It had forced the truth out into the cold morning air, where it was messy and confusing and painful, but at least it was real. We stood there for a long time in the quiet of the parking lot, the rising sun casting long shadows behind us. Two men caught between an ending and a new, uncertain beginning. The conflict wasn't over, but the silence had been broken. And in that, there was a fragile, terrifying glimmer of hope. The conversation in the parking lot did not magically resolve everything. There was no cinematic moment of revelation where all his confusion vanished. Instead, it was the beginning of a new, more difficult phase. The slow, painstaking work of building something honest in the wreckage of what we had been. We started talking, really talking, for the first time. We moved from the cold asphalt of the parking lot to a 24-hour diner, a place of fluorescent lights and chipped formica tables. We sat across from each other, nursing mugs of lukewarm coffee, and he began to speak. He told me about the pressure he'd always felt to follow a certain path: college, a steady job, a wife, a house in the suburbs. He spoke of his relationship with Sarah, of the genuine love that had been there, but also of the quiet, gnawing feeling that he was playing a role he'd been cast in, rather than living a life he had chosen. He talked about his loneliness, a profound and pervasive feeling that had been his constant companion even when he was in a crowded room. And he talked about me. He described how our quiet friendship had become the most stable, authentic thing in his life. He admitted that the comfort he sought from me wasn't just about escaping his own empty apartment. It was about seeking me. He confessed that the night of the kiss wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness, but the culmination of a feeling he had been refusing to acknowledge for months, a feeling that had no name and no place in the life he had planned. He was a man unmooring himself from the only coast he'd ever known, and he was terrified of the open sea. I listened. I didn't offer solutions or easy answers. I just created a space for his words, for his confusion and his fear. I told him about my own loneliness, about the walls I had built, and about how his presence had, brick by brick, dismantled them. I confessed the depth of my feelings for him, laying my own vulnerability bare. It was a conversation built on a terrifying and liberating honesty. We stripped away the pretenses, the assumptions, the unspoken rules that had governed our interactions for so long. By the time we left the diner, the sun was high in the sky, and we were both exhausted, but it was the clean exhaustion that comes after a fever has broken. Nothing was solved, but everything was different. The ambiguity had been replaced by a shared, acknowledged uncertainty, and somehow, that felt infinitely more stable. We entered a new phase, a period of intentional courtship that was both tender and tentative. We took a step back from the physical intimacy that had so unsettled him. He started sleeping in the guest room again. The door, however, was now always left open, a symbolic gesture of connection without the pressure of proximity. It was an acknowledgement that the path forward had to be built on a foundation of more than just shared grief and physical comfort. We had to get to know each other all over again, in this new light. We went on what could only be described as dates, though we never called them that. We explored the city in the daylight, a world we had previously only known in the dark. I took him to my favorite hidden corners, the places I photographed, and showed him how I saw the world. He, in turn, took me hiking, sharing his love for the outdoors, for the feeling of being small under a vast, open sky. It was during these quiet, shared experiences that a new kind of intimacy began to grow, one rooted in conversation and mutual discovery. I learned about his childhood, about his complicated relationship with his father, about his secret dream of being a carpenter. He learned about my art, about the quiet joy it brought me, and about the fears that had kept me so guarded for so long. We were slowly, carefully, mapping the uncharted territories of each other's inner worlds. The physical tension was still there, a constant, humming undercurrent, but it was no longer a source of anxiety. It was a promise, a future possibility that we were both consciously choosing to approach slowly, deliberately. The resolution came not in a grand declaration, but in a small, quiet moment of domestic peace. It had been several weeks since our talk in the diner. Sam was at my apartment, helping me frame some prints for a small gallery show. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. We worked in comfortable silence, the only sounds the rustle of paper and the soft click of the frame clamps. He was concentrating, his brow furrowed, his hands surprisingly deft and gentle with the fragile prints. I found myself just watching him, a wave of profound affection washing over me. It was a feeling so calm, so certain, it felt like coming home. He must have felt my gaze because he looked up, a questioning smile on his face. "What?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I just took in the sight of him, here in my sunlit apartment, a part of my life, a part of my home. The fear, the uncertainty, the remnants of his confusion, they all seemed to have finally receded, leaving behind a quiet, unshakable certainty. "This," I said finally, my voice soft. "This is good." He held my gaze, and in his eyes, I saw the same certainty reflected back at me. The turmoil was gone. The panic had subsided. In its place was a deep, steady calm. He put down the frame he was holding and walked over to me. He didn't kiss me. He just reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, a simple, solid gesture of connection. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It really is." That night, when we went to bed, he didn't go to the guest room. He came to my room, and when he lay down beside me, there was no chasm. He turned to face me, and I turned to face him. He reached for me, and I reached for him. And we simply held each other, a quiet, peaceful embrace that was more intimate than any kiss. There was no desperation in it, no frantic need for comfort. It was a conscious, mutual choice. It was an arrival. We had navigated the storm, we had weathered the aftermath, and we had found our way to a new, shared shore. In the end, We learned that a home is not always a place with four walls and a roof. Sometimes it is a person. It is the quiet space you build together, a sanctuary from the noise of the world. It is the silent understanding that passes between two people in a sunlit room. It is the profound, unshakable peace of knowing that you are no longer adrift, that you have found your harbor. Our beginning was disguised as an ordinary night, a simple act of kindness. But it was the start of everything. We had been two men, sitting in the dark, watching monitors. But we had learned to see each other. And in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, we found a language all our own, a quiet way of saying, "You are safe here. You are home."